Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action across time zones and across industries and hopefully across the world. We have a fantastic group of guests today to help us work through what the implications are of the US election. And of course, it has been a rather tumultuous time in US politics. I'm not going to comment on the politics, but just before I hand over to Cassandra Kelly to lead us through the discussion today, I was just going to make a few comments about some of the challenges which the current or the incoming administration faces. Of course, the current administration has faced them and not, I think most people would say, done a particularly good job. First of all, of course, the COVID crisis, everyone will be familiar with this map. The numbers continue to mount. The orange chart in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is the number of cases. The most alarming thing probably is the number of deaths, which continues to escalate globally in an almost linear fashion, albeit that has actually accelerated over the last month or so, reflecting the increased outbreaks. Again, the second wave in Europe, a second wave in the US. Secondly, looking at the US and comparing it to the rest of the world, the figures here on this chart from the FT show that the second wave in terms of case numbers is well established. Possibly the more alarming thing for the US, I think, is when you look at some of the Midwest states, and this is in the Dakotas and Wisconsin, etc., where the case numbers are now way higher than the New York peak. Of course, there is much better testing, but the underlying death rates or death numbers are increasing, which is obviously pretty alarming. And we can talk a little bit about what is already being put in place by the Biden administration during the discussion today, I think. Of course, the economic implications of this are severe, and we showed this chart in the show last week. I thought I'd repeat it just to illustrate the incredible spread of impact of unemployment. Many jobs have been recovered since the peak of job losses in late March, early April. But you look across the states here, those that are on the right-hand edge, still into double digits, very different from some of those at the left-hand side of this chart. Finally, of course, there is the much broader environmental issues. There are many different ways you can look at this. There's climate change and environment and pressures on agriculture. This is just simply a chart from the latest available data plotting what was the Arctic ice extent in a couple of days ago, the 7th of November. These numbers just continue to trend down. The best fit line fits quite well. This is not scientific, but it certainly tells a story. And I will just end before handing to Cassandra with playing a brief clip from the speech that Biden made the other day, where he talks explicitly about these challenges. And then after that, I think I will leave it with you, Cassandra.
Now this campaign is over. What is the will of the people? What is our mandate? I believe it's this. Americans have called upon us to marshal the forces of decency, the forces of fairness, to marshal the forces of science and the forces of hope in the great battles of our time. The battle to control the virus, the battle to build prosperity, the battle to secure your family's health care, the battle to achieve racial justice and root out systemic racism in this country, and the battle to save our planet by getting climate under control.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Nigel, and thank you to everyone who's joined the call. Welcome to the audience. I still get goosebumps when I listen again to some of the audio and some of the video. What a few days it has been. When the news arrived, I was sitting in Harlem. I was working at my computer, and suddenly there were these guttural screams, this sort of rolling sound of what I thought was pain. I actually thought something really awful had happened, and alarmed, I stood up to see what could be going on in the park across the road. And that was the first wave. And that was actually the sound of relief. It was this enormous guttural groan of, oh my God, it's going to be okay, from the local community. Then there was a second wave of jubilation. There were tears, there was cheering, crying, dancing, children on their scooters, fist pumping in the air. It was really something to behold. And so for me personally, it's been quite an incredible week, one of relief, even though the statistics showed and Pottinger ran some of the numbers, and I was assured that everything was going to be okay, there was still this deep sense of relief. But yet I feel like I'm hiding my light. I feel like I'm hiding my personal glow, because at the end of the day, for almost half of the population here, this is not the outcome that they wanted. This is not necessarily joyous, and we must remember that. So there's no space for gloating, and I can only hope that as we move forward with decency, as the taxi driver said to me today, when we're telling the truth again, maybe some of the people that didn't get what they want will see that there's a way forward for them with this administration as well. But I'm not the expert in these matters, and that's why I'm so glad to be joined by my panelists. I'm going to ask Andrew if he can join me first in the conversation. Andrew, if you can join me here, and welcome. So Andrew, thank you. When we spoke actually on the eve, I think it was, of the election, we talked of a Biden win, and also we talked about a scenario when what we saw was maybe far from comprehensive support for the new leadership, but rather proof of what one might call the divided states of America. And so as a professor of American history, I found it, I'm not sure that I found it comforting, but I found the context you gave me somewhat illuminating. And I'd love the audience to have the benefit of hearing some of what you shared with me. So if you might answer again some of the questions I posed to you, is what these results are telling us about the state of this nation, its people, and relationship to the rest of the world. And I know that's rather a lot, so perhaps we can start with a domestic view, sort of how did America get to be so polarized? And can we really lay the blame at the feet of just one leader? And is it polarized beyond repair?
Well, thanks for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for those enormous questions. We did talk at length about them the other night, or at least night for me. And they're difficult questions, and they're extremely difficult questions, but it's important to think of them historically. Before I answer what you just asked me, I would want to say, I've been thinking about this a lot, but as an historian, to me, what really stands out from this election, what I think people will see as a benchmark 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, will of course be a lot of the things that Biden and Trump are fighting over and that divides America, and how the United States moves on from here. But what's really significant is, and is not getting nearly as much attention as it should because of the context that's playing out, is the election of Kamala Harris as vice president, the first woman to be elected on a presidential ticket, the first African-American woman, the first South Asian of any of either gender. It really is something. And depending on how the US comes out of this crisis that it's in, because it will come out of the crisis at some point, Kamala Harris would be the bellwether, I think, even more than Joe Biden, because a lot of people voted for Biden because he wasn't Trump. And Kamala Harris could take things in really interesting directions that reflect the demographic changes that are going on in America, much like Obama did. And we might go from Obama to Harris, with Trump as this kind of really weird period in the middle. Whether you love him or loathe him, it's not been a dull period in the United States. So I see that as something that's going to be really, really, in terms of a landmark. In terms of how did America get to this situation, how did it get so polarized? There's no easy answer, of course, and I'll try and be brief. You can't blame it on any one individual. Obama himself said that in the 2018 midterms. He said, we can't blame Trump for how divided we are, how polarized the United States is. Historians date that to the 1960s and 70s. I mean, America's always been divided to some extent. A lot of societies are. The US fought a civil war, after all. But the current divisions that we see, the current culture wars that are playing out, begin in the 1960s. They really take off in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and then have played out more or less as we know them now. They've played out that way from the 70s onwards, in the 80s and 90s. And the term culture wars was created in the 1990s, when things were really bad. And at each moment along the way, Americans have thought, it can't get any more polarized. It can't get any worse than this. We're at the bottom now. And of course, it just keeps getting worse. And I used to tell my students, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, yes, America's polarized, but come on, it's not more polarized than it's ever been, as people were saying. It's been much more polarized in previous eras, and now I'm just not so sure. And the reason it's so bad, as you said in your introductory remarks, half the population didn't vote for Joe Biden. When he says he has a mandate, I think he does have a mandate, but it's not a Reagan-esque mandate of 1980. It's not a Franklin Delano Roosevelt mandate of 1932 or 1936. This is still a very, very divided country in which, as you said, half the population didn't vote for him. And to me, what stands out, without going into the historical detail, really stands out, is that the divisions now, the source of polarization, isn't so much about the specifics of individual issues, whether it's guns or religion or healthcare, but these issues have become symbolic, almost in a way that you could equate with a kind of nationalism or even religion, a non-spiritual kind of civic religion, as it were, but this very intense nationalism. And they've become symbolic over, in a very existential sense about who Americans are, to getting to the very core of identity. So it's not so much about policy, but about identity and what kind of nation the United States will be. And that wasn't, even during the culture wars, that wasn't always the case. The divisions over guns, the sort of what we now know as the gun rights lobby, is a product of the 1970s. A lot of issues that we talk about race and especially gender and sexuality, are products of the 1970s. Race has a much longer lineage, of course, but they've now become all-consuming. And Americans now, you hear them more and more say, this will be the end of the country as I know it if the other guy wins. And that's a very, very dangerous situation for a country to be in.
Yeah, agreed. So it's been really interesting as an Australian and British passport holder living in America over the years, and to try and explain to people the damage that has been done geopolitically, or from people looking in, and people all around the world saying, well, what is happening? So I guess I'm interested in when it comes to foreign policy or geopolitics, and as America looks out and the world looks back at it, what do they observe? Is America declining as a power, or is that just convenient propaganda for other nation states to be able to say that? And if it is in decline, or worse, actually, for what I think, it's broken, does a Biden win allow for us to reverse and heal, or is this just a fantasy land of mine?
Yeah, those are all good questions. It's amazing the extent to which the United States has fallen in the eyes of the world. And including among its closest allies. So my own pedigree is very similar to yours. I'm a Canadian who's a British passport holder who's also lived and taught in the United States for many years. And so I feel like I know all three countries well, and those countries are very close to the United States in so many ways. And it's really breathtaking to see. It's not so much anti-Americanism that you see in places like Canada or Britain or in Europe, although you do see some of that. But what you see is a kind of a lamentation, a kind of sorrow for what's befallen the United States, for the position that it's gotten into. And so to some extent, the United States has declined, of course, in international terms. I mean, the US has had periods like this before, around the time of the Iraq War, the international opinion of the US was also extremely low. But back then there were also countries that supported the US and what it was doing. Here, there's not a whole lot of optimism about where the US is headed in the rest of the world. And that's very telling. And I don't think the US has been in a period like that before. So in some sense, there is decline. Historians think about international decline, geopolitical decline in various ways, and political scientists too, I should add. But the two main ways are absolute decline and relative decline. So absolute decline, a country is in free fall. It's declining, it's collapsing, it's weakening in a whole bunch of very measurable ways. And then there's relative decline, where even if a country might be declining a little bit, maybe it's even getting stronger in certain areas, other countries are surpassing it. And what's really interesting is that the US often goes through periods of relative decline. And that's what I think that the US is going through now, where other countries, China, we can't really talk about, a rising China anymore. China's risen, China's here. And other countries have been catching up to the US as well and surpassing the US.
Could we say that the reputation's been in absolute decline?
That's a good way of putting it, actually. I hadn't thought of it like that. Right now, absolutely. Yeah, right now there is an absolute decline.
I was just listening to you then, I'm thinking, but on that one measure, I feel like absolutely there's been a decline.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it can't recover. But there is an absolute decline. Americans themselves in the past have thought about that they're not just in relative decline, but total decline. In the late 50s, there was a period like that. In the 70s, in the late 80s, and they're definitely feeling that now. Now, the U.S. has all the tools to arrest this decline, in terms of culture, in terms of tech, in terms of universities, in terms of its economy. So this decline, in a national sense, doesn't have to be absolute. It doesn't have to be permanent, I guess, is what I'm saying. But to get back to your first question, for the U.S. to kind of pull out of this, to get it out of its polarization, or to come out of its decline, it's going to take some doing.
Just as we're about to move to Rashid, I just wanted to mention a comment that was sent to me by email, not a question as far as I can tell, but you know, I think it's important to honor the audience. Socialism has been soundly rejected in America. However, the rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer Americans has all but eliminated the middle class. The extremely wealthy continue to expect protection of capitalism by the lower classes, who are owning a decreasing part of the economic pie. Rich folks need to find new ways to share the wealth in order to preserve their freedom to acquire more than they can ever use. Neither political party has come close to addressing this pressing issue. So a really easy one, just before you turn off your video and I join Rashid. Are they going to do it this time? Can it be? Is it just too big to be addressed?
It's pretty big to be addressed. It's really big to be addressed. I would say it's a really interesting comment. A lot of Americans love what is derided as socialism in terms of, even, you know, the Green New Deal, which is very controversial, but most Americans support most of the provisions of the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and climate, you know, other aspects of climate change. Those things are very popular, but the comment gets to this sense that the US is in another Gilded Age, and by a lot of measurements it is. The first Gilded Age was in the late 19th century, and that led to this huge wave of radicalism and revolutionary change and unrest in the US as well as elsewhere in the world. And then that led to progressivism and eventually to the New Deal. And that seemed to do the trick for quite a while. Is Biden capable of that? I'm not so sure he is, but it will take something like the New Deal, something that comes along once in a generation, many generations, to really bring America out of this crisis. And the last time they had that moment, 2008-9, you know, it didn't really happen. No,
absolutely. Well, look, I'm going to pass over to Rashid now, and I'll welcome you back on a little bit later, Andrew, if that's possible. Rashad, welcome.
Thank you.
So thank you. I've already explained to Rashad that I have enormous envy over his backdrop, which is not fake. And so welcome very much. And on that note, it's sort of, I think we're looking for some hope. One thing I enjoyed when talking to you about the other day is that you are also enormously pragmatic and don't seem to mince your words. Both you and I talk regularly to anyone who is brave enough to listen, and clients, about unleashing the best of humanity and talent to solve some of the world's most challenging issues. And so I'm genuinely delighted to have you join me today, Rashad. Thank you. And as I'm sort of grappling with the task of making America whole alone, let alone great, you know, and as we've been talking about before, you know, the divide, and you've obviously been busily using the word great in some of your thought leadership, which I find much more palatable and actually much more achievable. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with what I believe for you is the great reinvention and the great rewiring, can you share with us a little bit about what these mean?
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, to a great extent, prior to COVID, there were three fundamental shifts going on all over the world, which was also particularly impacting the United States. The first one was globalization, which I believe is unstoppable. Certain politicians will try to stop it, but when 6 billion people benefit from it, the other billion people cannot stop it. And as I remind people of the 20 busiest ports in the world, only 2 now are in the Western world, Rotterdam and LA. The others are not. So that's the first thing. Second is demographic shifts. And the United States demographic shifts are really 3. The first one, which you are basically seeing, is aging. 10,000 people turn 65 every day. The other one is multi-ethnicity. One of the key things in the Black Lives Matter, which surprised everybody, was how multi-ethnic the protesters were. They were also relatively young. The US becomes Caucasian minority under 21 next year. And the third one is the rural to city divide, which you saw in the recent elections. So those are the demographic shifts. You have obviously globalization, and then you have technology shifts. And we've had the first, second, and now the third connected ages of technology. And these three combined together are what is changing both the world and the United States. And they are unfortunately unstoppable trends. You cannot basically say, stop the world, I want to go off, or I don't want technology to progress, or demographic shifts to happen, or globalization. And one of the biggest challenges that most leaders have, including some of the leaders in the United States, including our current president who is about to leave, is the inability to adjust to reality. The first rule of leadership is, for God's sakes, when you look out of the window and it's raining, you should not say it's sunny, etc. So that is a key thing.
Or if you leave, take an umbrella.
Right. COVID-19 has basically not only accelerated these trends, but has done something particularly different. And what that has basically done is there is no new normal. So whenever someone says there is a new normal, I said, where? Maybe parts of China. It doesn't exist. Because what we've now had is a financial crisis, which is an economic crisis. We've had a health crisis. We've had a society crisis, all happening at the very same time, to every single person in the world, which means every single person in the United States, and for a year, which basically means that we are reinventing society. And society is going to be reinvented in the United States in ways we don't necessarily know, but the trends are relatively clear. We are a very fragile society, fragile business, and fragile human beings. And unless we address fragility, we will have very fragile government and a fragile country. It's been very clear, the fragility. It's like a meteor has hit the earth and you now see the earthquake lines, or the fault lines. We're now moving into a particular period right now, which is resilience, which is how do we fix some of these things, but we won't necessarily stop there. We, I think, are going to move into what I consider to be the resurrection. And the resurrection will be driven in three ways, which I'm pretty clear about. And you can yell and scream, but this is what's going to happen, because I'm a big believer that the United States muddles along and fixes itself. It always fixes itself and will fix itself this way. The first thing that is going to basically happen is you're going to basically see the rise and increasingly strength of labor. You're going to see unions coming back in a very strong way. You're going to see a big, big burst of labor. One of the reasons for that is because who are these frontline workers? And $15 an hour is not a living wage even today, even if you take it down up to 15. So you're going to basically see a very big rise in labor, because labor has figured out that the people who can be replaced is not them, but it's people like us. Our jobs can be zoomed away to a different country. Theirs cannot. That's number one. The number two, you're going to basically see, especially youth and a lot of other people putting pressures on organizations. The new ESG is not necessarily just environment, social, and governance. It's employees, society, and government. How are you looking after your employees? What are the positives and negatives on society of what you do? And are you paying your taxes? And are you backing government? ESG, with the exception of the environment, which is a major issue, which was external, it was all about selfishness and inside. That has passed. And you see that with the generational divide among the young people. If you ask people under 35 years old in the United States, it's dramatically different than the people who are supposed to be in power. And so I expect the next 3-4 years, there's going to be that particular, significant belief. And I think what we're going to go is from make America great again to make America well again.
Oh, I love that concept of making it well again. Certainly, it's not at the great stage yet. So again, one of the things I wanted to just check in with you is why is it in the short-term interest of business leaders to listen, to change?
The three reasons it's in the short-term interest besides the mid-term interest. The first is attracting and retaining employees. If you want to basically attract and retain world-class talent, you better be driven by purpose and values. And that is very clear in boardrooms. One of the reasons why so many companies boycotted Facebook because of Black Lives Matter were because the employees in the company pressured the boards and pressured executives. So that's one. The second one is very simply this, which is once you begin to have a society where there isn't enough money, what it means is you don't have enough buyers, unless you're selling Lear jets, etc. If you don't have enough money and people are just basically on social media and watching television, they won't be able to buy your products and services. So in effect, you need to basically recalibrate to grow your markets. Otherwise, there will be no markets, which is the second big issue. And the third one is just pure reality that when you have, as we have today in the United States, 20 million people out of work, lines on food banks, right? If you're a business person, you have two choices. Let this go on till there's violence on the streets or do something about it.
I'm just on mute. There's some discussion going on in the chat. I just want to speak to a question by Nancy. Welcome, Nancy. It's been a long time. Great to see you here. And her question is, do you think Biden's win will help to stem the rise of populism in the developed world?
I believe it will. And I believe that what is going to basically happen is the rise of populism is driven by the loss of hope. That's really what it is. When countries don't grow and you don't hope, you turn on everybody else, other countries, people who are not like you, etc. And when you have leaders, especially nationalist and populist leaders, who instead of figuring out how to give people hope, how to give people jobs, feed this one against the other, that is what the issue is. The reality of it, at some particular stage, you cannot live on slogans. You have to live on food. You need growth. And so at some particular stage, people are going to disconnect themselves from the matrix of imagination into the world of reality.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And may that be sooner rather than later, because we're certainly not playing a video game now. So although my children may well be outside. And on that, onto a video note, Nigel, before I hand over, I know, Rishad, there's going to be quite a few questions for you, I suspect, later, so I might hold some time for you. Can we just move, please, to the video that I think is a really good bridge before we move to Blair and get a little bit more reality in terms of a few things that were said from Biden about the soul of America and its restoration.
The battle for the soul of America. We must restore the soul of America. Our nation is shaped by the constant battle between our better angels and our darkest impulses. And what presidents say in this battle matters. It's time for our better angels to prevail. Tonight, the whole world is watching America. And I believe at our best, America is a beacon for the globe. We will lead not only by the example of our power, but by the power of our example.
Emotion there and strong and fine words. So we definitely need to restore the soul of America. Blair, I'm going to ask you to join me now, if you might. Look, she's already there. Mind reader. I didn't add that to your introduction, but I am going to. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're here, Blair. As some of you know, given that I can see who's dialed in, she's a dear friend. She's taught me an enormous amount over the years about things that I actually need to care about. I've had to ask a lot of questions and follow a lot of what she says to really get my head around how to leave the place less of a wreck than when I was born into it. She's a world expert on climate change, large-scale public advocacy, and thankfully, Blair has not given up, which is, as you know, when you deal with difficult issues, it's exhausting. And she is now the climate editor for Climate and Capital Media. So I'm absolutely touched to be able to have you join me today in this format, Blair. And I know from our conversation before the election and all the conversations we've had generally, that Biden winning signaled a chance for something better. And I was just hoping that you could share with us your thoughts on what this result does mean for the world in the sphere that you're influencing, And what is it that we need to consider or understand? And can we breathe a sigh of relief, or is there just such an enormous task ahead that you're just still sitting there feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I think the world changed pretty much over the last 2 weeks so significantly that it's actually quite hard to kind of get your head around what it means. We've had, just before the election, China, Korea, and Japan announcing net zero targets that are a significant market signal for change. And then the win by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris really means that virtually every country in the world, barring a handful of outliers, including Australia, I have to say, have now committed to absolutely flipping the switch away from a fossil fuel-based economy to a transition to low carbon in whatever form that may be, and many, many technologies, opportunities. The battle is on for who will kind of end up, around key issue areas, key technology areas. And love to talk in a little bit about the opportunities for America, because it has been 4 years of not interacting, but certainly not playing on the global stage in the kind of international negotiation sense. But it's also been very difficult, I know from talking to many, for businesses and for states who want to be actors and players internationally and do operate as international companies that are working where these things have already moved on, but the US has really lagged behind. So significant change, great opportunities. Will we do it in time? I guess that's the big question. I would say we have everything we need to do it in time. The question is, can we speed the policy drag that has kept us from moving quickly enough out of the way with the US election and make that leap to happen much faster? It can be done. So the question is, will we do it?
Powerful words. And so to that end, will we? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you want to hang on to the optimism of Asia being, they don't just generally say things like we do in the West for the purposes of making people feel good. When China decides it's going to move to net zero by 2060, they'll usually, in similar circumstances, hit way ahead of that target. Whether they can, in this case, it's a major transformation of everything they do power-wise. But they're on the track already. I think what we'll really need to watch over the next year is the cancellation of existing fossil fuel projects, that are new to come and already on the books and ready to go. If that transition happens and they are literally stopped and shifting, that's a pretty great signal that they are moving, they're committed to doing it fast. And how fast can the rest of the world kind of catch up, keep up? Europe already well ahead of the game, and the U.S. in many ways on renewables and a few other key areas has kept pace despite the not paying attention or being active on the international stage and at the national stage. Again, the opportunities are there. So, and one really exciting thing is watching how quickly money is moving, how excited people are about ideas of things like green recovery, Green New Deal opportunities for jobs. Rashid mentioned unions. It's very interesting to see how quickly there's being a change in that attitude of let's try and stop that move away from fossil fuels to what's in it for us and where are the jobs, how do we get to them? These are major transformations that are happening. It's a really positive sign. So I'm optimistic, but cautiously so. And it will really depend a lot on how Biden and Harris hit the ground running. And their policy is excellent. The question is, can they remove the blockers, such as maybe in the Senate, to deliver what they've committed to doing?
Blair, when we were on the call just before we joined, you were telling me about the announcement today in terms of the advisors, some no fee. Can you share for us, when you looked at that list, were there goosebumps?
It's pretty exciting and extremely impressive that the transition team has announced for every agency in the US government a review team of some of the best and brightest in the States, not the same people that have been around for the last 25 years. And all but, as I noticed, one, when listed how they would be paid for this work, said volunteer. So if that doesn't give you a bit of goosebumps about how eager people are to be part of the solution side of the US, and that transformation after 4 years of feeling like, sanity didn't exist, reality hasn't existed. We're ready to get back to addressing real issues, healthcare, jobs, climate change, energy, all of the things that are critical right now. It's really impressive. And, it's clear that, say what you will about Biden. That man has been in government literally his entire career. He knows how to work in government and get things done. Kamala Harris brings a very different perspective from California and her legal background and all of the focus of her work over the last 20 years. Together they're a pretty frightening combination. If the rest of government can go along with their plan. And, Biden's bent over backwards to say he's not interested in building a partisan, one way, I look great while I'm doing this government. He wants to heal. He wants to get on with change. He has plans to do that. The optimism sits with America coming around to the idea that this is in their best interest. I mean, we've just heard from two people that the U.S. is literally sitting on the knife edge of choosing to be irrelevant or relevant and look toward a future. It's that black and white.
And a dear friend of mine, I can see is in the audience, a Canadian saying, Lorraine Bell, welcome. Biden will need to work very quickly in the first year. I don't know that he can work quickly enough for us, Lorraine, but let's see how he goes. And, she makes the comment joining the Paris Agreement is paramount. She also makes a comment that so many things he can do, even without the Senate. Any comments you'd like to make generally around that before I'll ask the other panelists to join us?
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I'll tell you quickly 4 things on the Biden plan that I've had a real dive into since the winning of the election. Paris is number 1. Back in the game, player. China's move for net zero was clearly made timing wise to try to hang on to its very, very pivotal role internationally. That's not a bad thing because now there really is a race on as to see which countries are going to play a big role internationally, play a big role in the new climate economy. So Paris is big. The other 1.7 trillion budget for a green recovery from COVID, very much focused on low carbon innovation. The US is well positioned, particularly around tech, AI, and systems of how we manage this transition. That's complex energy. That's how do we look at resilience and extreme weather events? How do we manage big system preparedness under a climate impacted world? US is perfectly positioned to play that role if it chooses to do so in a way that maybe Asia isn't. Google is already doing work with NOAA just to look at how to better map climate impacts and extreme weather. That's just an example of how much the US can kind of jump in and play a role. AI is critical to how we approach the world from here. The other 3 quick things in the plan: naming and shaming global climate outliers. That would be Australia, that would be Russia, Saudi Arabia, etc. That's an interesting thing for the US to put in its initial plan. Hasn't been so great lately. So, it's got a way to go back to that, playing a hero role on the climate space. Stopping countries from cheating on their accounting on climate. Again, Australia not looking good. But also, maybe more importantly, making trade choices based on who the good players are on climate sends a very strong market signal to those not doing the right things. Australia again. And finally, a worldwide ban on fossil fuel subsidies. So pushing for that from the US could literally transform the energy sector, because around the world, fossil fuel subsidies is a major obstacle to the transition. So if the US does get behind that, and that's a real powerful position at the next COP, it'll make a big difference.
Amazing. Well, there's a lot of work ahead of you, evidently, Blair. So may you continue to give us your good influence and make sure the discussions that need to be had are indeed being had. So thank you. And I'm going to ask you to stay. And Richard and Andrew, if you can join me, that would be great. I can't help it. I've got so many questions coming up. And one of them I'm just going to put out there. One, I'm going to ask a second question. This is confusing, so keep your wits about you. I'm going to tell you what that question is so you can ruminate on it and then tell me who wants to answer it. But in the meantime, I'm then going to ask you to, if there's any questions you have for each other. And the question actually comes from a friend of mine, Trevor Rowe. In Australia, Trevor asks a non-trivial question. Are we in a post-US exceptionalism period? I Googled that, Trevor. You'll be glad to know when you wrote that. So I'm guessing it's Andrew, but it may be Richard, I'm not sure, or you, Blair. But if someone can put their hand at some point in time. But and while we're thinking about the answer to that non-trivial question, can I ask you, perhaps you've listened to each other and you all are actively involved in your areas, but are there any questions, or is there a question that one of you wants to ask or to the other, or you would like to build on what the other said?
Just one thing that I haven't mentioned, but it's so relevant to what our other two expert speakers have said around jobs in particular and imbalance and the US's need to address, the race issues, the class job issues. The fact that the Biden climate plan includes a huge focus on climate justice and jobs in communities that have been hardest hit by the impacts of things like oil processing in, say, the Gulf of Mexico. All of the health impacts, all of the fact that this stuff sits in low-income communities, usually African-American, sometimes Hispanic, is really important because the intersection of Black Lives Matter, unions, jobs, and climate solution. And Biden's plan really does show and look at this as investing in climate and the solutions here equals helping to solve that problem. That's pretty ahead of the game for many countries in the world, the addressing of the injustice side with the jobs and the opportunity side. So another thing to take a little hope from potentially if he's able to deliver it, but it'd be interesting to hear from both of you whether you think on the jobs front and the kind of turning the corner for the states in general front, whether this is an opportunity that to me looks like, having real potential.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Andrew.
I was just going to say, Blair, so much of what you said in your comments and also right there made me feel, obviously it's the biggest challenge. Climate change is the biggest challenge that's facing humanity. It's the biggest challenge facing not just the US, but all of us. And so much of what you said gave me real optimism. And especially on that note, what you sort of linking fighting climate change and getting to net zero carbon emissions and to better environmental policies that can also, they don't have to be working against economic growth or jobs or anything like that. If you can find a way, and I think a lot of countries are finding the way to make policies that are fighting climate change, that they don't fall disproportionately on working class people, on poor people, that you can transition a lot of people away from jobs that they rely on, that those jobs in themselves rely on fossil fuels and other things. If you can find a way then to transition the economy so that people actually benefit from it, I think that's the way forward. And so much of what you said gave me a lot of hope. It reminds me, this might be wholly grossly inappropriate, but it reminds me of a story that Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of War, which is the predecessor position to today's Secretary of Defense, told Franklin Roosevelt as the US was getting involved in World War II. And he said, look, if you want to win this war most effectively, you've got to bring business on side, because FDR didn't have the best relationship with American business. He said, if you want to do this, you have to basically take your war strategy and your war policy and your foreign policy and dovetail it with the economy. And then, FDR did exactly that. And the US then roared out of the Depression. The New Deal didn't end the Depression, the war did. And it then became the arsenal of democracy that was able to provide so much of what the rest of the world needed or the Allies needed to win the war. Now, it might be an inappropriate analogy for all sorts of reasons, but that notion that if you can dovetail what needs to be done with economic gain, then I think then the sky's the limit in so many ways. And so much of what you said really gave me a lot of hope for that.
Wonderful. So over to Trevor Rowe's question, which is, are we in a post-US exceptionalism period? I don't know why I'm staring at you, Andrew. It may not be your fault to answer this one, but if anyone else wants to go, be my guest. I will not be answering it.
I'll be really brief. I do have a thought on that, is that, so we are, I think, in the eyes of the rest of the world, for sure. And I don't think we ever will be in terms of how Americans see themselves. I mean, exceptionalism America's exceptional according to exceptionalism in two ways: qualitatively, that America's better, and quantitatively, that America's different. And the two relate in that America's better because it's different in so many ways. That's what Americans tell themselves, and a lot of other people around the world kind of believe that. But the whole idea of American exceptionalism, the term wasn't coined until the 1950s and then widely applied to the United States. So it's not this timeless concept, although in a nationalistic sense, Americans have thought in exceptionalist terms for a long time. But it's no coincidence that it's coined in the 1950s. The US comes out of World War II with half the world's gold reserves, half the world's GDP. I mean, it's just this colossus, didn't suffer any physical damage during World War II, almost no civilian casualties. And yeah, America seemed like an exceptional nation in the 1950s. And of course, Donald Trump has never said when MAGA, when America was great. He never says when he wants to return, what period he wants to return America to. But it's clear from everything he says, including in this election campaign about suburbs, it's clear from everything he says that he wants to take America back to the 50s when it was unquestionably an exceptional nation. And if we are moving to a post-exceptionalist age, then Trump himself has done more than anyone else to have actually make that happen.
Absolutely. Paul Foster asked the question that we've all been wondering, and Stephen Colbert actually said, and I don't think necessarily jokingly, but is the election over, Paul asks. Gambling markets are giving Trump 10% chance of winning versus Biden with 90. Is the risk of a Trump win still real? Will he step aside?
So my sense is that the election is over, and the reason for that is pure mathematics. Recounts tend to basically change votes in less than 1,000 votes in any direction. Even in the closest state, which is the recount state of Georgia, there's about 5,000 or 6,000 votes that separate the two. And in others, it's in the 10,000 plus. So that's number one. All of this is really drama for Act Two. And Act Two basically is how can he raise money to pay off some of his debts? What he's currently raising money, there's a little asterisk that says, in addition to being a defense fund, it helps him pay off his debts. That's number one. The number two is so he can basically launch a financial platform with which he can continue to berate from outside and have power and support. He's done. But the reason why the Republicans are not saying he's done is because what the election has proved is despite everything he did for the past 4 years, which many of us probably do not appreciate, more people voted for him than anybody but who voted for Biden in the history of people who voted.
Absolutely. So as the commentators have talked about, somewhat falsely, just as we have actually had a blue wave, but at the same time we had a red one, which leaves us in an unfortunately no landslide position. However, I do believe that Biden will make the mandate clear. He has already started framing that and getting the message very out clearly. And we do know now that he will not, I don't know those of you who've been watching the 4-season landscaping, but he will not be making America rake again. So this is excellent. Some of you will know what I'm referring to if you've been on Twitter lately.
Absolutely.
But he's very good at gardening, or at least Trump's about to become good at gardening and eating chocolate cake, which is fantastic. So I just want to, sorry, Andrew, please.
Can I add something just very briefly? I don't disagree with anything Rashad just said. What will be really telling about what Biden can do going forward is just how united the Democrats can remain. And there's already sniping in the New York Times with sort of competing interviews between Ocasio-Cortez and Conor Lamb about who's to blame for the fact that Democrats didn't do as well in the congressional results for this election. Was it the moderates? Was it the left? And if the Democrats can't remain united, then it's going to be very difficult for them to get anything done.
Yeah. An interesting comment from Murray Galbraith in the chat. He's less concerned about whether Trump has a comeback 2024 or otherwise than he is the pent-up frustration from his supporters. I too am concerned about that, Murray. I have had a meeting in a supermarket, as you do, of someone that had just driven back from Dutchess County and had an altercation in the gas station with a gentleman, two men, one in his pickup truck and another in his Q7, and then a few others filling up there at the pump. And the gentleman in the pickup truck happened to be Caucasian, turns to them and tells them in no uncertain language that he wants to kill them. They decide to sort of step away, walk away. And but the man in the Q7, very beautifully dressed, sort of turns to him and says, "I voted the same as you." And the man looks confused, but the other voters who were quietly walking away thinking, we don't want to reply and we certainly don't want to be shot here in this gas station, even for them, they said he was really struck, and they went to each other afterwards and realized, that they were actually in danger. That two totally looking different people are both very, very unhappy with the outcome. They vote both Trump supporters. So I agree with you that we've got some difficult times ahead. Ira Kaufman, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask one from Jerry Grove White. Ira, great to see you. It's been a long time since we last met in person, and excited that your book is coming out. You might want to tell people about that in the chat, what that's going to be about, but very topical. So to your question, which has just gone off my screen, as wants to do, was about the demographic of the young voter. And if I was sensible, I wrote it down. I did. Clearly, the next generation is acknowledged as a demographic voting bloc. But are they going to be included at the table as a decision maker? What do you think, Blair?
Yeah, it's probably one of the questions of our decade, because who wants action on climate change? The next generation does. And without any doubt, like the numbers are almost, off the chart to, statistically, young people just can't see why older people are even questioning this, or why we're just not getting on with it. And quite sensibly so, because the existential risks that it presents to them in the next, right now, we're looking at a hurricane that hit the US twice. It hit once, it went around the Caribbean and came back around to have another shot at Florida, first time in history. I mean, you can't miss the weather impacts hammering us day after day after day. The bushfires of the west coast of the US and Australia, the untold impact of that on people, on economies, on communities, and the death toll from heat, from smoke. It's right. It's not 5 years from now. It's not 25 years from now. It is right now. So these are, young people who see that, who know they're going to have to live with it and clean up the mess made by few previous generations who just carried on without any, consideration for what it was going to mean to their own children and grandchildren. They're angry about it, as we often see in many of the protests that are going on around the world. They're in my mind, they're justifiably angry, because we can and should have addressed this over the last 25 years in a sensible way that didn't hit people and force them out of jobs. Now we're making it very, very hard for ourselves. So that age divide is critical to getting across the issues that are important to that generation, which are very real to all of us and should be listened to and heard. And I think if one ESG change could happen worldwide, it would be to bump up the inclusion of young people in decision-making at all levels, whether it's in companies, in government, in city, state, local, and national, and even international UN level. We need to have young voices and attitudes about change and how they're going to work in the future and live in the future, integrated into the planning and the government that we're rolling out every day.
And yes, Ira, I don't want you to think I'm dodging the last part of your question. Absolutely, we need young people to be included, or younger people to be included in panels like these. I don't yet class myself as old, but getting old. And indeed we do, and we will continue to. And many people like Blair and others that run these things around the world are very conscious to include the voice. But I think we could all do a better job of making sure there's more of that at the table. As Paul Smith, a friend of mine, does in board world and so forth, really get them, as Blair said, around the table, making the decisions, not being told afterwards or as an afterthought. So there is another important question from Jerry Grove White. He asked earlier on, I wonder what the panel think about renewal of infrastructure, drinking water, roads, airports, flood protection, education facilities, etc. And I'm assuming he's pertaining to the US. Will there, will we see increased investment in this area?
Yeah, I quick answer to that, and then over to Rashad, who probably has lots to say. But again, the green recovery approach is all about that investment into infrastructure, looking at, you're going to spend money on COVID recovery anyway, might as well spend it on things that have double or triple positive impact. So long-term investment into community infrastructure, preparedness and resilience in the face of climate change and extreme weather, jobs in communities, green jobs for the future, whether it's renewables and that energy transition piece. It's kind of got everything if you really wanted to see it. And I don't have the figures in front of me, but I've seen 3 studies and reports that show investment in green recovery, the positive impacts on health, climate, people, communities, jobs, long-term jobs, not just short-term jobs. It's off the charts in terms of the financial benefit you get from making that investment that way, instead of, for instance, putting it in our case in Australia, gas, which is inevitably going to go. Our market's dropping rapidly around the world. So, you can't prop this stuff up. Why throw the money away on things that simply aren't going to be around in 25 to 50 years? So absolutely important, really critical. And we don't have time to talk about climate risk as a topic, but it's so understood. And I recommend a session, ESGX, on climate risk and resilience, because it's a whole new world economically for companies that are acting and those that are ignoring it. But I just think too, blended investment structures and green finance that are blended versus straight, money making seem to be where a lot of this stuff is going. And it has real positive potential for communities, but also for investors and for solving these problems in a way that is not just a charity kind of approach, but that is really about investing in resilience and future growth and communities kind of owning solutions in their own space and taking control of that.
So many wonderful questions coming up. What a credit to the 3 of you. I am going to call it to a close now. If there are pressing questions, I'm sure ESGX will be able to steal some time from our panelists just to get some of your questions answered. However, I do, before we leave, in the spirit of the SGX, we always ask, what can we do, irrespective of whether our day job includes it, whether it's new to us? If we hear this and we feel compelled on something that was being said today, what can we, the audience, do to help progress healing, to help accelerate decency and humanity, or any of the above agendas that we've talked about today? Please, if you could offer us some ideas.
I think the one piece of advice I would give people is to build a case for the exact opposite of what they believe. Because one of the big challenges we have is we have stopped talking to each other. Everybody has taken a position that paints the other person as stupid. And, to my point, 70 million people who voted for Trump are not stupid, for instance. That's number one. And the inability to understand the other point of view means we will not solve much, because you can only solve through conversation and compromise.
There's a friend of mine who's a relationship counselor said, try 3 words, tell me more. I think that's a great way to start. Blair, you're nodding in that kind of nodding way.
Yeah, tell me more. When you work on issues, I'm sure like all of us do, assume that because we specialize in particular areas of interest that are interesting to us, other people may be just getting through the day with jobs and families and their own personal challenges. So expecting them to understand and really think in the way that maybe all of us have made a career out of things, and these people haven't had that luxury. I mean, quite honestly, we have the luxury of education, of privilege in many ways, of access to jobs that are interesting and involved with big issues. Many, many people don't have that opportunity. So opening your mind to talking to them about what they think is important might be your first thing to start with.
Beautiful. And tell me more, Andrew. One thing.
Well, at that, tell me more. It's great. And just thinking about when Rishad was giving his, I think, really eloquent idea, I was thinking of Obama's speech on race in the 2008 campaign, in which he said exactly that. And that was a moment where maybe the United States could have changed the conversation a little to make it a bit more productive and a little less angry. But what I would do, I'm a specialist in the history of American foreign policy. So mine is maybe a little more straightforward and not as imaginative, but I think the US needs to learn not to see world problems first and foremost a lot of times through a military lens, and that military intervention shouldn't be used as a political tool as a first resort. It should be an absolute last resort. And then even then you have to think, is this really the last resort? And over certainly the last 20 years, but really the last 50, 60 years, that hasn't been the case. And that's led to so many mistakes, and it's led to so many preventable, unnecessary problems that have then gone on to cause so many more social and environmental problems. And so I think if the US US foreign policy, British foreign policy, learns a little more humility, that will do the world a lot of good.
Amazing. Well, what a privilege it has been for me to join you here this evening, this morning, whichever time zone you might be in. The timing of this, when I was asked to moderate, I was excited. I didn't know what I would be facing, what scenario, but I knew that we needed to be having a conversation about where to from here with whatever the outcome was. Conversation, no gloating, no space for that. Yes, for some of us, we feel there needed to be change because we don't think without a change of presidency that we could get some of it done. But if we want to convince other people, we need to be able to listen. Thank you, therefore, to the audience for listening. Thank you, your questions, the richness in the commentary. I'm hoping someone's taken it because I want to have a chance to really read it. The multitasking these days is, as we know, we're not really that good at it. I was doing my best, but I'm sure I missed some really important points. Thank you to friends, family. Thank you to loved ones, people that I care deeply about from joining all around the world. Amazing to see you there, really lifted my spirits. And again, I am really grateful to ESGX for including me in the discussion. And I will now hand over to, I believe, Paul, who will talk about where to from here for ESGX. Thank you.
And I've just posted a link to a newsletter I write every week. It's completely free on different issues. So if people are interested, they can subscribe. It's rishad.substack.com.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. Over to you, Paul, and thank you very much all.
I should say that it's a fantastic newsletter, by the way. I'll hand over to Paul, but I couldn't recommend Rishad's, the things that he's putting out more. Paul.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks very much, Cassandra, for moderating. And thank you, Blair, Rishad, and Andrew for joining us today. Delighted that we have a global audience from Australia, Asia, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. As we do always, the ESGX.org is free, online, and global. There was a question about additional explanations of MMT and modern monetary theory. So some of you may recall that Dr. Stephanie Kelton wrote The Deficit Myth, which he explained at an earlier ESGX, and Nigel's holding up the book that you can see. And there's an ESGX.org bookstore. So if you forget the name or the title, go to the ESGX.org website bookstore. So coming up in ESGXs, we have an upcoming Green Jobs Report for November. That's going to happen the week after US Thanksgiving. So it's actually going to happen on December 1st. Nigel and I and Nick Gower of the SGX team are organizing a Preparing for 2021, and that'll be on December 8th on ESGX.org. And then Green Santa will return. So Blair will be very happy to know that Sustainable Santa will celebrate the holidays in mid-December, December 15th. And then we will most likely take the rest of the year off and the beginning of the Australian holidays and be on break from mid-December to mid-January. So thanks so much for everybody for participating. Remember to share and like on social media. Thanks to our producer, Nick Gower, my co-host, Nigel Lake in New York. I'm Paul Herman in San Francisco. We'll look forward to seeing you next time on ESGX.org.